So yeah, more about my favorite system, the endocrine system. Last lecture we did cover the two lobes or two main lobes of the pituitary gland. We had the anterior lobe and posterior lobe, again named after their respective anatomical directions. We did cover the posterior lobe more last lecture, and what we saw is that you have these neurons right here, and they secrete chemicals via this into this blood supply via this inferior hypophyseal artery. And this blood supply takes the chemicals secreted by these groups of neurons over here, and once it's in the bloodstream, now they become hormones that can be carried to the rest of the body. And what were those neurohypophyseal hormones? Well, those were our ADH and oxytocin. So again, one of the main targets of ADH are the kidneys because they help to regulate the water balance in your body. And oxytocin, it has reproductive functions, but also cognitive and neural functions. It's very important in establishing relationships, trust, and romance and attraction. So there are two very different hormones, but believe me, they're both peptide hormones and very small, and they're actually kind of similar in their general shape, but even though there are 9 peptides each, they have totally different functions. Okay. And let's see, if you can't make the first exam, can you go to the testing center? Yes, so then the Manoa Testing Center is already set up for all our exams. If you are on a neighbor island and want to use their testing center, let me know, because there are many UH campuses, and usually for any testing center, even if it's a mainland one, they require some sort of like X amount of business days in advance. So if you're trying to like ask for accommodations like the weekend before, they're probably not going to accept that. So if you are planning on using another testing center besides the Manoa Testing Center, and if you're using the Manoa Testing Center, again, they have limited capacity, so you don't have to take it exactly on the day. So this is why there's a huge window for the Manoa Testing Center versus the Top Hat. Okay, so now let's talk about the anterior lobe a little more. Or actually, we did get to talk about the anterior lobe. So it does have its own separate blood supply that goes to the anterior pituitary lobe. And what we have is the first wave of hormones being released here. And this is just like not saying these are the only neurons, but it's just saying in general, we have these neurosecretory neurons originating in the hypothalamus, and they secrete a first wave of hormones that ends up and they're collectively called releasing hormones. We did cover what the different types of releasing hormones are in general last lecture, and these releasing hormones target endocrine cells that are in the anterior pituitary. So these endocrine cells react to the releasing hormones by releasing a second wave of hormones. Sometimes they're called tropic hormones, sometimes they're called stimulating hormones, sometimes they're called something else. And then this goes off into the rest of the body. Now, depending where does it go into the body and what does it target? Well, depends on which tropic, stimulating, or other hormones there are. Now, to compare and contrast the anterior and posterior lobes, what are the differences? Well, they have different blood supplies. In the anterior lobe, we have the superior hypophyseal artery, and then in the posterior, we have an inferior hypophyseal artery. And then anterior, we have these things called portal vessels, and this is the one that connects the neurons, or not the neurons, the hormones secreted by the first wave from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. These portal vessels help to connect that and ferry that first wave of hormone to the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. The posterior, you don't see these portal vessels because why? Again, when in the posterior lobe, when the neurons secrete those hormones, then that goes straight out with the blood supply. And then what we have are those releasing hormones in the anterior pituitary. So again, that's the first wave, but you don't have that first wave in posterior. I mean, the first wave is the final product. So these neurons directly secrete these hormones into the bloodstream. And then the anterior pituitary lobe is where you find these endocrine cells, and that releases that second wave of hormones in response to the releasing hormones. Whereas posterior, again, the neurons directly secrete, so there's no second wave. There are no endocrine cells in the posterior lobe that react just like the anterior lobes. All right, so again, same organ, but different lobes have different ways of controlling. And we did cover the basis, so again, with basic hypothalamic pituitary control, you have the releasing hormones between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland, the endocrine cells produce the second wave of hormones, and if there's a target organ, then they'll produce a third wave of hormones. Sometimes there's not just a distinct target endocrine organ, so sometimes it's only 2 waves of hormones, sometimes it's 3 waves of hormones. And let's see, so you might be like, wait, why is it so complicated? And this is why a lot of people are like, when they first encounter the endocrine system, like, oh my god, this is really complicated. And it is. And it's like, why can't they just be like the posterior pituitary lobe and just secrete hormones directly into circulation? Why do we have to go for this first wave of hormones, the second wave, and this third wave? Well, yeah, so why don't we just have one final hormone and just have all this produced by the brain and just secrete it directly into circulation? Well, one advantage of having these multiple waves and cascades of hormones is amplification. By amplification, like when you amplify a signal or amplify a sound, you increase the signal and boost it so it's stronger. And this is why the main advantage of having these multiple waves of hormones. Now with that, to kind of like show it as like an abstraction, so what I'm going to show you is like, okay, we established with hypothalamic pituitary control in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. We have the hypothalamus secreting hormones that target endocrine cells in the pituitary gland. And then this might target a second or another organ, endocrine organ, that makes a third wave of hormones. But is it just one-to-one? Well, the thing is that the hypothalamus, say it releases its releasing hormones, there's not just one endocrine cell. You have many endocrine cells in the pituitary gland that can respond to hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. Say in this example, again, there are many more cells, but to show, for simplicity's sake, I'm only showing you a few. You have multiple endocrine cells, and if they all have receptors for this releasing hormone, these endocrine cells, once they're activated by binding this releasing hormone, they're going to release their own second wave of hormones. So this tropic or stimulating hormone. So now these hormones are being produced by these endocrine cells over here, and now they can go to target organs, cells, or tissues that also have the receptors for this hormone over here. And what we notice is that we're having this exponential increase in the signal. With every step, we release 3 hormones here, and if each of these cells are releasing 3 hormones per unit of time, they're going to release more hormones that can bind more receptors. And these target organs and cells can now secrete their own third wave of hormone. So this is what we saw with different steps. We have this cascade, but with each step, we're starting to secrete more and more hormones. So this is why one of the main advantages of having this hormone cascade is that, yeah, you have the sequence, but with each sequence, now you're having a stronger and stronger signal. The hypothalamus itself, say it was able to secrete this final organ, that would require a lot of cells, that would require a lot of nutrients and energy. So this is a way it's able to kind of distribute and spread it. Or like, think of it this way, like say you want to, okay, pretend the pandemic's over and you want to have a great graduation party. Like, I mean, there's an announcement that they're hoping for an in-person graduation. I hope for everyone's sake that you get the opportunity, a safe opportunity to do so if you're graduating. But say like, or you're having a party, you don't have to worry about pandemics. Everyone, like, best case scenario, everyone's immune. And then you're saying, okay, I'm going to text 3 people, and then these 3 people text 3 other people, and everyone that second wave texts 3 other people. Then you have a whole block party, even though you initially only invited 3 people. So that is an example of amplifying a signal. So this is why these hormone cascades are very important, because they amplify this activation, this pathway of activation, and at the very final step you have this huge signal at the end. Now, with the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland, let's go to top hat and do a little checkpoint and review. Alright, so I did kind of reveal the answer earlier, but if you weren't there, then so put these organs and tissues in order of how they're activated in the endocrine system. So for this question, don't take negative feedback or turning it off. How do you turn this system of endocrine organs on? What's the order that they're switched on? Alright, let's see what the most common response was. So the most popular order was hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal gland. and the most popular order is the correct order. So let's go back to our slides. So yeah, this is the way you activate this pathway, and this is what so hypothalamus, pituitary, so it's always that order, hypothalamus then pituitary in terms of activation, and then the adrenal glands are activated. So this is what we call the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Definitely worth knowing, especially if you're going to like studying for med school. Like, this is scientific canon. Like, I'm pretty much sure if there's an endocrine question, it's high chance it'll be related to this. But with this HPA axis, what you have is the hypothalamus secreting this releasing hormone called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. This targets the pituitary that has the receptors for CRH. The pituitary, when it's activated, or the endocrine cells that have the receptors for CRH, they're going to produce a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or also known as ACTH. And then the ACTH, once it binds to receptors and it targets the adrenal glands. So once the adrenal glands are with the receptors for ACTH, they get activated, then they're going to produce cortisol. So I'm going to bring this up, like this one of my mnemonics, and this is here. So here are our cheerleaders for our Rainbow Warrior cheerleaders, right? They're the hype women and hype men for our athletes. So think of it this way, they're all about getting people amped up, and they're all about getting things excited and getting everything all energized and getting everything, especially like a good example of sympathetic activation. They want excitement, right? So this is my mnemonic for this cascade of hormones and tissues. So Hawaii cheerleaders perform amazing acrobatics. And you can add your own little cheer at the end for that. So this tells you the order of these organs and the first letter of these hormones released at each level of this. So again, our hypothalamus produces CRH, our pituitary produces ACTH, and our adrenal glands in this HPA axis, they produce cortisol. Or corticosteroids, but cortisol is the main one I want you to know. Alright, so this is the HPA axis. So again, there are 3 waves in the HPA axis, and it involves hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal cortex. And there are 3 different separate waves of hormones that are amplified with each consecutive step. Alright, so again, ACTH does do aldosterone, but I definitely want you to know that cortisol part right here. Now let's go to our second top hat question. Hopefully you kept that open. Alright, now this is a different axis and a different target organ. So instead of adrenal gland, now we have the thyroid gland. Okay, let's see the most common response. So the most common response was hypothalamus pituitary thyroid, and this is correct. So this is the way you activate in this system. And to go back to explain this part, yeah, so again, with any sort of hypothalamic pituitary control, it's always hypothalamus before pituitary, but in the HPT axis, what you have is a different set of releasing hormones. So again, this is not the same thing as the HPA axis. Therefore, there's a different set of hormones. So in the HPT axis, the first wave of hormones is what we call TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. And then the second wave from the pituitary gland is what we call TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And this stimulates the thyroid, unsurprisingly. And then they produce thyroid hormones, T3 and T4 we'll get to in a future lecture. And now this hits the systemic circulation. And last top hat question for today. Now let's go here. So put these organs and tissues in order of how they're activated in the endocrine system. So instead of thyroid or adrenal gland, we have the ovary in the female body, or the testes in the male body. So the ovaries and testes, there are what we call gonads, so reproductive organs. Okay, let's see the most common responses. So this is the most common popular order, and this is correct. So notice that with these axes, it's always hypothalamus, pituitary, and then whatever target organ at the very end. And for the HP, and these are called like collectively the HPG axis, but sometimes they say for the hypothalamus, pituitary, ovarian axis, they say HPO. Testes, they would say like, they probably would call it the HPG because HPT is already the thyroid axis. But what you have is like in both like sexes, what we have are like the first hormone cascade is what we call gonadotropin releasing hormones. So again, this is different from CRH, different from TRH. So this gonadotropin releasing hormone doesn't directly target the gonads, but eventually it will activate it. The pituitary gland, in response to GnRH, and the N is typically lowercase, just to clarify this part, is going to produce both FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. This is the same in both sexes. Now, in the female body, we have ovaries, that's the female gonad, and in the male body, we have testes. But the ovaries are going to produce these sex hormones, these testosterone, estrogens, and progestogens as well. That's the third hormone wave. So sometimes you have like at these different waves, it's not just one single type of molecule. You might have like multiple molecules being released, but it is in the sequential order. And the testes, androgens are the primary male sex hormones. So this is what we have for the third wave. But these first two steps in both sexes, they're the same in this HPG axis. And again, the G stands for gonad, right? So GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormones that eventually release the primary sex hormones for females and males respectively. Now, growth hormone and prolactin, they are interesting. They're exceptions to this first, second, third wave. Yes, growth hormone and prolactin are pituitary hormones, but they are, instead of having a third wave, they are released to systemic circulation, and growth hormone has very wide effects, whereas prolactin has very specific effects. Now, with growth hormone, what we have is releasing hormone, and then we have tropic hormones, rewind that. So this is our typical 1, 2, 3 waves of hypothalamic, pituitary, and then some sort of target organ control. So this includes our HPA axis, our HPT axis, and our HPG axes. Now with growth hormone and prolactin, they have the releasing hormone, but instead of having a third wave, growth hormone is the final product, prolactin is its own final product as well. So are these called direct hormones? Yeah. Whereas prolactin, so instead of having like 3 waves of hormones, these are the final products over here. And prolactin, there are many things it can affect, including reproductive organs, and the mammary glands are the target organs. But are they going to produce the third wave of hormones? No. So tropic hormones, can you define tropic? So tropic hormones, think of it this way, they're collectively referring to these hormones over here. So when in tropic hormones, if you have like a typical HPT, or just like a typical hypothalamic pituitary axis, releasing hormones are collectively the first wave, tropic hormones are collectively the second wave, and then depending on the target organ, you have that third wave. So tropic is kind of like that middle step right here. Alright, so with growth hormone, so you might have also heard called HGH, the H standing for human growth hormone. So that's what we have here, and it's a peptide hormone. So typically growth hormone is in some sort of water-based solution when it's given. Now, it has many effects in many tissues, and this is why you can't say it's like only one single target organ, because growth hormone is very powerful, and this is why growth hormone is super powerful, because many tissues and cells have what we have. They have growth hormone receptors on their surface. So now these effects, do I want you to know all the effects of growth hormones? That would be a long page of information, but I'm just going to give you examples. So like cell growth, if you have like all these cells in a petri dish and give them growth hormone, this is going to increase their rate of cell growth, and then also immune function as well. This boosts your immune cells and boosts their proliferation and their dividing, and you have more of these immune cells. And it improves your metabolism as well. So metabolism being the rate of all these chemical reactions in your body. Cognitive function, muscle growth. I mean, this is where some of you might be familiar with this. And many tissues. So it's not just about muscle growth. Like, I think, I don't know if it's still popular, but I remember like maybe a decade or so, like it was very popular in Hollywood because some, I guess, boutique doctor was kind of saying like, this is the fountain of youth because it does all this regeneration and rejuvenation, improves your thinking, improves your immune system. But the thing is that it's not just muscle growth, it also pretty much increases the growth of almost all the soft connective tissue, or not just soft connective tissues, but connective tissues in your body in general. So that also includes bones, internal organs, and yeah, so this is why growth hormone is super powerful, because it can affect so many different types of cells. Now, everyone knows about, or so everyone has grown up, hopefully, like, unless there's a congenital condition, where if you have a growth hormone deficiency, what's that going to affect? Well, it's going to affect, again, growth hormone affects connective tissues, and bone is a connective tissue. So if you have a deficiency of growth hormone, you're going to have a deficiency in growth of that bone tissue. And so what we have here is like children of the same age, and this individual over here on the left of this figure, she has a growth hormone deficiency, so she's shorter than average than her. This is why, like, if you have, like, in pediatrics, they say like percentiles, and they say like, oh, compared to, like, in statistics, like, compared to all the children around the same age, are they like in the bottom quartile or percentages, or are they in the top percentages? And if they're kind of in that lower statistical range, they are considered to have a growth hormone deficiency. And this is what they're looking at. And this is why it's important, if you have a child, to kind of get these regular checkups, so to make say, okay, is there a possible growth hormone deficiency, or are they just kind of like a little around just a little below average? And this is why pediatricians often measure this. Like, it's easy to measure, non-invasive. Now, say you have a growth hormone excess, and this is like, they're way above that percentile. They're in like the 95th percentile. So this is what we call a different thing. We call it gigantism. So gigantism is specifically refers to I mean, they both involve growth hormones. Like, we have gigantism and acromegaly, but a gigantism is pretty much reserved for excess growth hormone in children, in the pediatrics. Yeah, so then, and then acromegaly, so excess growth hormone into adulthood. So acromegaly is like, sometimes you might have normal levels of growth hormone in childhood, and then all of a sudden maybe it's a pituitary tumor or some other interesting thing happens in your body where, or say someone's taking too much growth hormones, you have excess growth hormone. It can result in a condition called acromegaly. And you have swelling of soft tissues, especially the connective tissues in these soft tissues, and brow and jaw protrusion. So again, remember that your brow line and your frontal lobe, and you're just like, not frontal lobe, but yeah, your frontal bones and all your facial bones and whatnot, they are bones, and they are connective tissues. So you can have all these connective tissues and bones of your face being stimulated to grow, and this is why we see this brow and jaw protrusion. Maxillary widening, remember the maxilla forming part of your, like the front part of your face and your upper jaw as well. So this is an individual with acromegaly, and look at the jaw. I know sometimes I've heard the term lantern jaw used, and look at how it's kind of protruding as well. So yeah, all this growth hormone in this body, this individual's body, is causing these to kind of to protrude as well. And then what we have here is like, okay, so this is Sylvester Stallone, and this is very, now, I don't have any proof. This is all just like speculation, and like, this is not like alleged stuff. But yeah, this is him in 1976, and if you've seen that Rocky Balboa he did back in 2006, he was 60 years old. And this is around the same age, so like these facial pictures, but I mean, look at, there are changes in normal skin changes and connective tissue changes you expect to see with 30 years of aging. But I'm like, whoa, look at, like, especially the chin, and like how the cheeks and everything here are kind of like spaced out more, and look at that body now. This is all alleged and whatnot, and I can't say for sure, but I mean, I think this is definitely pretty amazing compared to, like, I mean, I don't know too many 60-year-olds who are built like that, but it's not like, it's almost like an open secret in Hollywood that PEDs are kind of used, right? But I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm definitely see some sort of facial change here. So this is why. But what's another example of that affects growth hormones? Not just bones, but also growth of internal organs, because internal organs also have a lot of connective tissue as well. And this is why with people who do use PEDs and admit to doing that, that's why sometimes you also see this. Now, this guy's abdomen is very distended and protruding. And does he have a lot of fat? Not really, right? He has a six-pack, but his abdominals and rectus abdominis is being pushed out, right? So the thing about growth hormone is that it also causes internal organs like the liver, the small and large intestines to grow as well. And so this is why we can have this happening where you have growth of muscles, but with other organs behind those muscles growing as well, that can cause that. So I would have to see a reference for that part, but yeah, the thing is that, as someone said in later on, data for collected for percentiles. So percentiles, it's like, okay, do you take the statistics? So it's like, okay, what's the average? And this is also with like how we measure hormones as well. We have to use statistics and say like, okay, not everyone is going to have the same level of hormones as well, but if we have someone who's like below average in terms of their hormones, yeah, maybe we should check and see if they do have deficiency or if it's their actual basal level. Now with height, easy to measure, and maybe they are naturally smaller than average, but this might be impetus, like, because we don't rely in medicine on just one metric. Typically, like, say, okay, does this child actually have a growth hormone deficiency? Maybe we'll look at blood work, and then we'll look at their levels of growth hormone and say like, hey, is it around average, or is it below average? Then if we see, oh, compared to children who are around the normal height or taller, we see that they have below average levels of growth hormone. This is why sometimes they might prescribe growth hormones to children, because they say, okay, we measure their blood levels and we confirm that they do have a growth hormone deficiency as well. Yeah, six-pack, that's okay. Yeah, so then what we have here. All right, so with prolactin, what we have here is like enable production of milk in mammary glands. So prolactin, so lactation, that's pretty obvious, right? Now high prolactin, so the interesting thing is that if you have high levels of prolactin, you have decreased sex hormones in both sexes. So it's not just about lactation in females, but prolactin can also affect males as well. So we have a decrease in estrogens if you have high level of prolactin, decreased levels of testosterone in male if you have high prolactin. Now, so the other thing is like, okay, for males, like high prolactin is bad, but what we also see is like low prolactin is bad as well, because that also affects reproductive health. So this is the thing with hormones, is that there's no such thing as a good hormone or a bad hormone. Having abnormal levels that are too high or too low of any hormone can result in health consequences and disease. So what we have here is like high prolactin, lower sex hormones. That's going to also affect reproductive health as well. Low prolactin, sexual dysfunction and fertility problems. So this is why homeostasis is very important, because you want just the right level amount of hormones to keep your functions of your body normal, and not have some sort of dysfunction due to having too low levels of a hormone or too high levels of a hormone. So this is why the typical internal medicine, like say, if they suspect an endocrinological problem, they'll do blood work and see like, okay, what are the levels of hormones in your body? Now, hormone balance is very important. And yes, men can lactate. Now, this is a very interesting case. So yes, men can lactate in very unique cases. And then I think there was like a example in the Camp Lejeune I forgot where it was, but I remember that there was this case with one of the Marine base camps where there was a leakage of all these carcinogens in the water supply, and some of the men developed breast cancer and they start to lactate. And now this one is interesting, like fruit bats, like some other species, they lactate as well. And you might have heard of sometimes when male babies are born, I think colloquially it's called witch's milk. Sometimes they lactate at birth due to the levels of hormones in the womb they were exposed to, but that doesn't persist past the birth. Yeah, so this guy, he lactates. And if you watch the episode, you find out that he actually has a brain tumor called prolactinoma. So this was like cranking out the amount of prolactin in his body so much he started to lactate. And so it's kind of interesting too, because he produces so much milk, he has to kind of express milk. Like if someone's pregnant and they are breastfeeding, sometimes they say, okay, it kind of hurts when it's too swollen. This breast tissue has too much milk, so they have to express it and release it. So yeah, I think, I forgot how much, but it was something like an order of magnitude, like 10 times the normal amount. So this is why blood work is very important for endocrinology and hormones. Yeah, so I mean, I admire his bravery. He went on freaking national television in the UK and showed that he has like gynecomastia and lactate. So my props to him that he actually showed like, yes, men can lactate, but it was also due to that endocrine tumor. So yeah, very amazing. Now, prolactin and weight gain. I have to look that up as well. So yeah, this is interesting, but yeah, prolactin, what I'm getting at there is like, yeah, affects lactation, but it also affects reproductive health, not just in women, but also in men as well. Yeah, awkward interview. All right, so here we have the two lobes, and what about this part right in the middle right here? So this is what we call the pars intermedia, and this is from the Martini version of the book. So this is the pars intermedia, and it's known for secreting this thing called melanocyte-stimulating hormones. Now, look at this little parentheses that says not normal or not active in normal adults. So in typical non-pregnant adults, we see that this isn't produced typically. So what are the anterior pituitary hormones? To review, so my favorite mnemonic, so active teens prefer getting free lunches, and this tells you the 6 canonical anterior pituitary hormones. Now, with melanocyte stimulating hormone, this MSH, well, this is where I'll point it out. So the open stacks, which I agree with more, it says, so, or go back to Martini. So Martini in the previous table says that MSH and the pars intermedia is part of the anterior pituitary, and I don't quite agree with that. So if you're but if you're using another textbook or class that refers to the pars intermedia as part of the anterior pituitary lobe, you can add our little localization and say that melanocyte stimulating hormone is, we can include that mnemonic. But OpenStax more accurately says that MSH, this melanocyte stimulating hormone, is in what we call the intermediate zone, or sometimes called the intermediate lobe. So this is the OpenStax version, and this is the part that's more canonical, or what I consider canonical. But I'm also telling you that, yeah, the two textbooks disagree. I won't test you, I won't tell you, or I won't ask you, like, if is MSH part of the anterior lobe or posterior lobe. I think that's a little tricky because, again, our two primary sources are conflicting on that. But this is why I say, like, it's not part of the anterior lobe, because if you look at the histological level, the pars intermedia has its distinct look compared to the anterior pituitary lobe over here and the posterior pituitary lobe. And it's in other organisms and creatures, it's also called the intermediate lobe as well. So then here we have a carp brain, or actually carp pituitary gland. So you notice that the pars distalis, or the anterior pituitary lobe, and the pars intermedia, this intermediate lobe, is much more pronounced. So sometimes this intermediate lobe isn't this tiny sliver wedged between the anterior and posterior. So in other organisms, it might be bigger and its own more functional or part of the pituitary gland. Yep, so this is the way I remember it. So melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, is produced by the intermediate pituitary, so the pars intermedia. So I think it's all about the M for MSH. It causes melanocytes to produce melanin. And melanin, the role of, so we know what melanin, if you were here last semester, you know what melanin is. But the role in humans is still poorly understood about MSH, and it's actually part of another type of group of hormones. Well, yeah, I don't think we're gonna have time to cover it, but it's not the main. Even though we know melanocytes produce melanin, and melanin is one of the main pigments in our skin, it's not the major cause of pigmentation in healthy non-pregnant adults. And why do you say non-pregnant? Well, you might have heard of that term, like if you know someone who's pregnant or if you've been pregnant in the past, this thing called pregnancy glow. And the interesting thing is that we see during pregnancy, many hormones change, including MSH. So with increased MSH being produced in some people who are pregnant, we see that this causes some changes in blood in their skin. So they might have what some people will call the pregnancy glow. It's not just melanin. You also have increased blood vessels and blood supply to the skin as well. Or some people even say, like, I think I saw on Reddit that someone said, like, my acne disappeared when I was pregnant. I was like, so all these interesting and wonderful things happen during pregnancy, especially on the endocrine level. So this is one of the things that can happen. But again, what is the main cause of pigmentation in humans? So again, this is why a lot of people like to visit here in the islands, right? So you're out here on the beach, and what happens eventually? Well, you start to tan, or if you're in a place that doesn't get a lot of UV radiation, you might use, or if you want an extra crispy turn, like if you're here last semester, you know what it looked like with that one example. Yeah, so if you're out here there in the sun, eventually you're going to have this sort of increased pigmentation, and in this case, we see if you don't have enough UV radiation, then you don't have that change in skin color. So remember that melanocytes, they produce that type or category of chemicals we call melanin. There are different types of melanin, but for this semester, just know, again, melanin is the main like dark pigment, and depending on the type of melanin, it can be reddish or typically dark and brown, black, or blackish. And this is like, so this per individual over here produces a lot of this melanin over here, but if some people don't produce much melanin at all. So, and we have this very spectrum of all these skin tones and different levels of melanin. So again, melanin is a dark pigment. Then the more melanin you produce, the darker your skin tone and complexion. Yeah. Now, here we go back to, and what stimulates the melanocytes to produce melanin? Well, again, back to the integumentary system and skin. So you have epidermis, endermis, and then UVA and UVB. So again, this ultraviolet radiation. UVC exists, but is mostly filtered out by our ozone layer. But with UVA radiation, this penetrates deeper, and UVB, this stops here at the epidermal layer. But they both can stimulate melanocytes to produce melanin. And why is it important for melanocytes to produce melanin? Again, so this is a cartoon of DNA, and remember that DNA has all these chemical bonds. Now, these photons that these ultraviolet light, these photons at ultraviolet frequencies, and wavelengths, they're going to carry energy, and this energy can break these chemical bonds. So this is why UV light can damage the chemical bonds in our cells and all the molecules that make up our cells, including our DNA. Now, melanin is produced by melanocytes. Why? Because melanin kind of takes the hit. Melanin itself is made from chemical bonds. Now, you don't need to know the chemical structure of melanin in this class, and if you've taken organic chemistry, you can see why. It has this property called resonance, where it can absorb this energy and we can break these bonds easier. So melanin, in short, takes the hit from UV light. So this is why it's important, and this is how melanin is protecting our own bodies against UV light, by absorbing the energy from ultraviolet frequencies. Now here we have UVB light penetrating the skin and stimulating melanocytes to produce melanin, and this is why we tan, because again, more UV exposure, more chances of DNA damage and damaging things like also our collagen and our connective tissues as well. So by making more melanin, this increased melanin absorbs more UVB light, thereby protecting our skin against further UV radiation damage. Now, UVD light is also important in producing what we call vitamin D3, or cholecalciferol. So vitamin D3 over here is very interesting. If you remember our hormone classes, the three main ones for this class I want you to know, those monoamines, those peptide and protein hormones, and we also have our steroids. Now, with vitamin D3, what do you think that is? And I actually don't have Top Hat set up for this one, But, or actually I can set up a poll. Or what? Monoamine. Creating a poll in the YouTube chat. So vitamin D3, what do you think we should classify it as based on those three main categories of hormones? ASMR. I don't know, someone in the office says like, I know when you're in the office because I can always hear you typing. So majority, or not majority, but the plurality of you said, so in first place we have 47% people saying peptide or protein, 37% saying steroid, 15% saying monoamine. So what we have here are, so the interesting thing that, remember that steroid hormones, these are made from cholesterol. Now vitamin D3 is very interesting because you have something, this is a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol, and this is actually the starting molecule for making vitamin D3. So remember that a typical steroid and typical sterol has 4 rings, these 3 hexagons and a pentagon. Now what UVB light does is that it breaks this chemical bond. Again, remember that UV light and photons, they carry energy. This energy can also break this chemical bond. But in this case, instead of damaging DNA, UVB light can also break chemical bonds in the 7-dehydrocholesterol. So when this happens, now we get this new compound called cholecalciferol, also known as vitamin D3. So vitamin D3 is an interesting exception because it is classified as a steroid. It's transported like a steroid. It has cell receptors inside the nucleus like a steroid hormone receptor. So it behaves like a steroid because it started out like a steroid hormone. The thing is that it doesn't, this is an exception to that 4-ring typical structure of a cholesterol and steroid hormone because this ring was broken. So this second ring right here. So this is, but the other 3 rings stay intact. So it's not a peptide, it's too small to be a peptide. It's not a monoamine because it's not made from an amino acid directly. So it is made from cholesterol, but it's a special type. So vitamin D3 is classified as a steroid. Yeah. Okay, so we covered the pituitary hormones and their targets, and let's see, we already covered this, and I think I'll have to cover this at the next lecture. So how do we turn this off? We talked about how to activate hormones, but how do you turn these hormone cascades off? Because the thing is, like what we saw with and actually we already saw some pack back questions. ADH is very important, but are we always producing high levels of ADH all the time? Do we want to produce ADH all the time at high levels? The thing about hormones is that if you want their effects, maybe that would provide some sort of way of dealing with the current situation in your body or changes that you're experiencing, or your body needs to maintain homeostasis. But when things are back to normal, do you want that hormone still active in your body? So, right, so see you all next week, and take care until then. Stay healthy, please. Again, we don't need case numbers going up. So I'll see you all, and thanks for attending.